All right, Blaine, whenever you're ready, take it
All
away.
right, there's a train in the background.
But, we'll wait for that.
It's Johnson City, Tennessee. Welcome everybody to Paleo Talks. We are at episode 21 this week. And this week we're going to be learning about, what's the title again? Not just a mutt?
More than a mutt. America's earliest domesticated dogs.
And this week's a little bit different in that we're going to have two guests that will be working through these questions with conversation. Our own Dr. Chris Widga, but then joining us from England is Angela Perry, Dr. Angela Perry.
Hi. At
Durham and Department of Archaeology over there. And Angela, if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and telling us a little bit about your background and how you got started in this field.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at Portland State University in Oregon with Virginia Butler and Ken Ames there. And Virginia is a pretty amazing zooarchaeologist. And during my classes with her and with Ken, I just really got into kind of early prehistory of North America and North American fauna. And like a lot of people who are in dog research, already was a crazy dog person. So like just kind of fit myself right in there in the dog world. And then I went on to do my PhD on dog burials kind of across the world and the use of dogs as hunting technology. Then went on to do postdoc at the Mutt Institute in Germany, and now in Durham. Dogs just keep going. I told Chris today, I can't get away from them. Once you get into the dog world, you try to escape, but there's no escape.
There's so much love. So much love.
No escape.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And of course, everybody knows Dr. Chris Widga. If you've been watching the show, he's given actually more talks on this than anybody else at this point. So mastodons and now dogs. And so
I think we have to count them as incremental talks because not all of them are just me.
I should say that Chris and I know each other. I did an internship at the Illinois State Museum when Chris was working there, and so we got to know each other pretty well there, and of course talked dogs a lot, and then ended up doing a paper together on the North American dogs. So Chris and I know each other in real life as well as virtual life.
IRL, yeah.
IRL, as the kids say.
And I can blame Angela for bringing me back to dogs. So as many of you know, I started out as a zooarchaeologist and worked a lot on Paleo-Indian sites and kind of hunter-gatherer sites and that sort of thing in the plains. And dogs actually had a chapter in my dissertation. But when I wrote my dissertation, there was not the research that was happening now on dogs. And so it was, I won't say it was stagnant, but it was kind of, we were very, this is what you did with dogs. You measured them up, and then you would have kind of a bunch of questions you really couldn't answer. You didn't have the tools or the theoretical context to really answer them. And so I finished my dissertation, and like many of us, dropped it. Didn't think about it at all until Angela showed up. You know, we had kind of talked about dogs in the hallways at the Illinois State Museum for a couple of weeks while she was there. And then I remember the day. There was this afternoon. It was kind of that low lull after lunch. And I'm kind of starting to drift away. And Angela stops in my open doorway and she says, okay, tell me about these dogs that you looked at for your dissertation. And that started this conversation that really hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
And dogs are so cool, not just from like the archaeological and anthropological side of things, but as an evolutionary issue, an evolutionary problem. Thinking about domestication we think about evolution all the time as paleontologists, but thinking about something that is driven by people and kind of artificial selection is something that's totally different.
Yeah.
And Chris, that was in 2008.
Oh,
Scary.
no. Really?
Scary.
And I left the Illinois State Museum in 2000, so we all have that connection. Well, let's move along here. And David, I already stole a little bit of what you were going to say, but if you could remind everybody how the program works this time.
Absolutely, not a problem. As usual, we're going to be having our guests lead a presentation. And then after about 30 minutes of that, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. This time it's going to be a little different, as Blaine said. We have two guests, so they're going to be talking back and forth between them, but the basic format is the same. They're going to tell us about the research, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So when that time comes, we'll let everybody know it's time to start putting your questions in the comments section of the Facebook video. And as always, if for whatever reason you can't leave a comment on Facebook, go ahead and find us at the Gray Fossil Site Twitter or Instagram page. Send us a message there. I'll be keeping an eye on those as well so that we don't miss anybody's questions. And then we'll try to get through as many of those as we can.
All right, thanks, David. Just a reminder, we are coming to you from Johnson City, Tennessee, East Tennessee State University, and the Center of Excellence in Paleontology. And I'm Blaine Schubert, and I will interject questions as we go along, and especially if you guys stall out, but I don't see that happening at all here. Angela and I are actually working on another project together, some canids, and I don't know if we'll talk at all about
Future
that.
Paleo Talk.
Yeah, that's a future Paleo Talk.
That'd be fun.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure. So if you guys would share your screen, we can go ahead and get started.
All right. So yeah, like Blaine was saying, Angela and I, we've worked on a lot of things through the years, and when we kind of get together, it just turns into this long conversation, and it often drags in other people. So Blaine, we'll probably drag you in, regardless of whether you want to be dragged in. But you know, large carnivores play kind of a big role in this. But we thought we sat down and we thought, well, you know, one of the coolest things about dogs is there are so many open questions, and there's so many kind of edges of research and areas where we don't really know. And so one of the things that we kind of thought was, let's have this conversation back and forth. There'll be a couple of questions that kind of move us along and kind of push us in the right direction throughout the half an hour. But you know, the goal is to get everybody to think about questions. So yeah, I guess I'll just start. Let's see. So one of the cool things about dogs that fascinates me is just simply their diversity. You have really big dogs, you have really small dogs, you have all these different breeds. And as a paleontologist, as an archaeologist, you know, working on dogs, part of my brain is going, how did we get here? What is it that we see today, maybe in these dogs, that we can then also kind of project into the past? Ultimately, all this diversity most of the diversity you see today is kind of post-Victorian. And so it's really just directed breeding that's kind of happened in the last few hundred years at most. And Angela might get into a little bit of some of the deeper time of some of those genetic patterns, but this is kind of one of the really fascinating parts of this. Is as a morphologist, I'm thinking, okay, so we've got a big dogs and small dogs and all these different breeds and different shapes and sizes. How do we sort this out? It's not necessarily clear cut. What is a wild canid? What's a domesticated canid? What's a big dog, small dog, in and out? You know, these sorts of things. And the DNA has only made it more complicated, to the point where the geneticists have coined the term Canis supus as the as the Latin name for you know, anything canid, because they can all interbreed. Yeah. What we're going to really kind of focus on today is this idea of how we got where we are, how we got to about 200 years, how we got to that point where you had this post-Victorian kind of boom in dog breeding. We know that dogs came from gray wolves, and Angela talked a little bit about that down the road, but we know that they came from gray wolves. We know that we've got these purebred dogs, or this Victorian effort to breed dogs into different shapes and sizes. And before that, we obviously had some sort of village dog type, very variable, different in different places. Ultimately, it was domesticated from wolves. What we'll be talking about today is really this middle, really interesting part, which in between village dogs and gray wolves. This is where evolution happens. This is where domestication happens. And there's a whole lot of new tools that are kind of out there that we've been using for the last couple of years, and they've changed a lot of our ideas about how this all works. And so I guess the first question that we're going to kind of start with is, where do North America's dogs first come from?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just kind of jump in here. So one of the things that when I think about this question, one of the things that maybe people don't realize we have not sorted out yet. So if you go back just a second, Chris, to that last slide. So we have this idea of, we know that modern dogs have descended from gray wolves. One thing that's kind of an issue with that is we have yet to find the source population of these gray wolves. We say we know they came from gray wolves. When you look at the genetics, all modern wolf populations are equally distant from modern dog populations. So what that means to us when we're looking at genetics is that none of the modern wolf populations are the source population for domesticated dogs. So that either means that the source for domesticated dogs is some common ancestor to all the modern wolf populations, or it's a wolf population that is yet unsampled and is potentially extinct. Most probably is extinct, as we have yet to find what the source population is. We can see it's some kind of gray wolf, but what is it? Where was it? Where did all of this start is still probably the core question, and something that is still the biggest mystery to us, unanswered, have not found that population yet.
Do we think that domestication occurred many times or a single time?
So if you ask our 2016 paper, where we were 100% sure we had sorted out that there were multiple domestications, we would say yes, probably domesticated in multiple places. One thing we do know is that we tend to see the most variation in East Asian dogs, and usually the populations that are closest to the source population tend to have the most variation in them. And so I think that has always been the kind of source idea of an East Asian dog domestication. There are very few Chinese or East Asian ancient wolf samples. It's we've come across very few of them. They must be somewhere. They might be somewhere in some museums, but there are very few that have been looked at. And as of yet, we haven't found an East Asian population. There have been a number of suggestions. Many people propose Europe. Some people propose Central Asia. So there have been kind of this idea. One thing we do know for sure, and we'll kind of get into this, is that North America is not a source population. We don't have domestication that we have found yet happening in North America. So the dogs that are in North America, these very first dogs into North America, as you can see here, are definitely being introduced into the Americas. They're not being domesticated in the Americas. So as you can see here, this is from our 2018 paper. We know we have at least 4 introductions of dogs into the Americas. So we have this first earliest introduction that's coming with most likely the earliest kind of human migrations, peopling of the Americas. And then we know we have another kind of introduction of dogs that's probably coming with the Thule population. And there have been kind of an explosion, I would say, of this Arctic dog research in the last few years, especially. So those dogs are kind of going across the Canadian Arctic and into Greenland. And those dogs are still related, are modern Arctic dogs, Siberian Huskies, Alaskan Huskies, Malamutes, Greenland sledge dogs. Those are their ancestors. So if you want to say that you have truly one of the oldest kind of ancient dogs, if you have one of these Arctic dogs, they are actually of this ancient kind of Thule age lineage.
So they're kind of separate from all the Victorian breeds and that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're definitely kind of ancestral from this Siberian population related to Zhukov Island and the East Siberian Sea. So they definitely have they're of an ancient lineage, but not of this kind of very first entrance into the Americas lineage. They're coming from this kind of Thule age.
This paper was really cool, Angela. This is one
Thanks.
that it answered one of the biggest questions I had up until that point, which was, do we have multiple domestication events here in North America?
Yeah.
Because coming to kind of thinking about domestication as a paleontologist, as a person who thinks about evolution, but thinking about it as artificial selection also, one of the things as archaeologists that we are very, very aware of is that there's this information flow. And the idea of being able to basically have in your mind, in your cultural repertoire, the ability to have a completely separate domestication event is a possibility.
Yeah.
But what this paper did is it said, well, it may be a possibility, but it really constrains it and probably not much of a reality. So I was really glad to see this one.
Yeah, so one of the things we could see with this is that we definitely have introgression of North American wolves into these early North American dogs. So you definitely don't see a case of people coming in with their dogs and keeping their dogs completely separate, as if you could, completely separate from coyotes or wolves or anything like that. So you have these early dogs that do have introgression from coyotes and North American wolves. So you see North American wolves in their DNA, but you can tell that it's not a source population. So that's, and one of the questions we did have is that it was a potential with the kind of timing we're talking about as far as dog domestication in East Asia or Europe, that people who are coming into the Americas could have potentially seen domesticated dogs, could have known of the concept of having a domesticated dog and come into the Americas encountering North American wolves and then attempting the process of domestication themselves. So that was a very real question, or really a real possibility, but we've yet to come across any North American dogs, ancient North American dogs that have a North American kind of wolf. So I guess that moves us into this.
You mentioned the introgression with wolves through time here in the Americas. Is it a lot more with wolves than it is with coyotes?
That is a good question. It's a regional question. So I think what we'll get into a little bit with costers, in the coster dogs, we do see a bit of coyote ancestry in the coster dogs. I think the story of canids is that they will breed with each other freely and openly and as much as possible. So I think, I was doing field work in Kazakhstan a few years ago, and some local people there were telling me how they purposely now kind of leave their dogs out to have relations with the local wolf populations, that they believe they make stronger, better dogs to then fight off the wolves from their herds. And I was just thinking, wow, what a nightmare for me as an archaeologist who does DNA, trying to look at, is this an ancient dog? Recent wolf introgression and coyote introgression, I think, was probably happening continuously, and is still happening now when given the opportunity. So I don't see any kind of much difference. We see introgression of both coyote and wolves into the DNA. So
and with that, you just kind of killed a couple of foundational ideas to how we think about how animals change. Number one,
it's hard.
What is a species?
The idea of a species is so flexible and fluid in Canis. Wolves, coyotes, the dogs, they can all interbreed. But then the other idea is domestication, and one of the foundational tenets of domestication is that you can control the reproductive population.
Yeah. I mean, one of my questions when we found that coyote ancestry in Coster was, did they know their dog was coyotish? Did they know, like, there's something wrong with this litter? They're a little off, or, was that a totally normal thing for them to have introgression of wolves and coyotes and their dogs? Was that just like a normal occurrence to them, or did it change the way they interacted with their dogs if it was a kind of coyote litter or something like that? Like, interesting, thoughts on how culturally they were potentially, treated differently. So I guess we're talking about where they go into the family tree with this slightly complex work that we're doing right now. So from that 2018 paper, we decided to look a little bit closer at the idea of whether we could kind of correlate splits in early North American dog populations with what's going on with the peopling of the Americas. So some of the work that we did a bit further on this identified this initial split at 22.8. So I'll just say there are some pretty big confidence intervals on this. I think 22.8 is between 26 and 20. So that's kind of the confidence intervals we're dealing with here as far as time frames. So that split that we identified between those two dog clades. So A clade is the kind of East Asian dog clade, and the clade of all ancient North American ancient dogs are in this kind of A group, A clade. So within that A group, this is kind of how it splits out as far as the Siberian and the North American dogs, is that at about 22.8, we see this split between two populations. So when we see that split, it really suggests to us that by that time, we must have dog domestication. If we're seeing a split within these kind of populations. So that's really interesting, first of all, because we're now moving from this time frame where we were pretty sure 15, 16, we definitely had domesticated dogs. So we're now kind of pushing that back a bit to saying that we have dogs in Siberia by around 22.8. Might be a little bit earlier, might be a little bit later, but we're thinking we have dogs in Siberia during that time. And then we go further down the line, and then we see at about 16.4, we have another split in dogs. And so this split is really interesting because this group that we call A2B, it's also known as pre-contact dogs, or the first dogs into the Americas. So we see a split again between another Siberian dog population and this A2B group that eventually makes it into North America at around 16.4. So again, a pretty large confidence interval in that between like 18.6 thousand years ago and 14.3 thousand years ago. So we see a split in that population, and one group goes off and becomes a kind of Siberian dog group, leading to, for example, huskies and Malamutes and things like that. And then we have this A2B group that moves into the Americas. And then we see a third split, kind of this star radiation split at around 15,000, which leads into these kind of 4 North American or Pan-American dog groups. So that split at about 15,000 is interesting because we know that split definitely probably happened once they were in North America, because we don't have any of these A2B dogs anywhere outside the Americas. So we don't have them in Siberia or Beringia or anything like that. They're all on the kind of Eastern Beringian North American side. So we're pretty sure that split happens once they're in the Americas. So it's a pretty exciting kind of way to look at that. And so kind of this is what it looks like across the board, looking at specifically those A2B groups that I was talking about. So if you kind of look in the Americas, Canada region, you can see a little bit how those are split out. There are a lot of them on top of each other because we have a lot of dogs at some sites. But you can see that light blue and dark blue are kind of across the board in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland and things like that. So those are those Siberian dogs that eventually make it over with the Thule population and are kind of exclusive to this Siberian American Arctic Greenlandic region, never really make it south of the ice sheets. But then you have this kind of red, orange, yellow color that are these 4 haplogroups that we identified in the Americas. And what's interesting about these is they tend to be from the samples that I have right now, which is looking at only about 70-something samples that we did in that paper, is there's an interesting kind of regional pattern. So you have this one group that's kind of Pan-American, got them all over. And then you got another group that's very specifically in the mid-continent of the US. And then you have two groups that are very specifically isolated in this kind of coastal Pacific Northwest, Alaskan, and then the Catalina islands. So the Channel Islands in California. So we're looking at kind of next steps of what we can do with this. Can we use this to help figure out where people were going in the Americas? Are dogs an amazing proxy for doing this? We have some issues with that, of course, because we all know that dogs get traded and moved around, and dogs move when people don't move sometimes. And so it's an interesting kind of story of what's going on with dogs, and are they moving in a way that we can kind of track people by tracking dogs.
So yeah, so Angela's talking about kind of this world of DNA and these samples that we're getting on early dogs, and early dogs being, not just the ones that are 10,000 plus years old, but probably also quite a few that are kind of in the 8,000, 7,000, 5,000 range.
Yeah.
Am I right? Yeah, and trying to understand, and those of you that watched the emails Mastodon talk last week, you're probably getting used to some of these pictures, except rather than going north here, we've got this guy down here in South America that is a similar haplogroup as some of the stuff in North America. So there's a thread here to kind of start teasing apart. But where do we get some of this data? It has to come from the fossil record. It has to come from the archaeological record. And this is the record that we've been dealing with for years. If we look at North America as a whole, these are not really common sites. So this is just a quick screen grab from one of our big databases, Neotoma Paleoecological database. And our red dots here are fossil coyotes. The blue dots, the green dots are wolves. So we've got some wolves here in the west, some wolves in the east. And then the blue dots are things that are Canis spa. They could be wolves, coyotes, or dogs, or something else. And among these things, we have kind of 4 or 5 kind of solid Paleo-Indian age dogs that are kind of 10,000, around 10,000 or 10,000 plus. They come from Utah, from Wyoming, Colorado, and then there's this one here in Illinois that we'll talk about in more detail. But part of the reason why it's the DNA is really changing the game here is because, here is what some of these things look like. This is a little chunk of the agate basin dog. Not a lot of morphology to work off of here. We might be able to get some tooth measurements. We could probably do some ecological work on isotopes or microwear or something like that, but we're definitely not going to get at what their skull looked like or what their jaw looked like or anything like that.
So Chris, what are the morphological characters that allow you to say, this is probably a dog and not a wolf?
Oh, he just drops the hard question just right there.
Yes. The traditional idea is that you have pedomorphosis in dogs, that basically people were selecting for kind of puppy-like features. And so you'd have a shortening of the jaw, a smaller body size, and that sort of thing. But what we're finding is actually that it's much more complicated. You have quite a bit of variability in dogs. In fact, you have more variability in dogs than you have in wild canines. Although they're still they're separate from wild canines. So it's a really, really interesting kind of place to go, and we haven't quite figured it out yet. But we're going to kind of focus on these two that are over here in the Midwest, Coster and Stillwell, because these were curated at the Illinois State Museum when Angela and I were both there. And as we were talking about dogs, this would come up. We'd be like, oh, well, I wonder what's going on at 10,000 years ago in the Midwest with these dogs. And of course, we had collections right down the hall that we were able to kind of pull out and start thinking about. And these aren't just fragments. These are some of the earliest, most complete dogs in North America. And part of this was also kind of a bigger project, just looking at where are some of these early dogs. So, thinking about them in Iowa and Missouri and other places like that. But these two really stand out these two sites stand out for both the completeness and the preservation that is in these sites. Coster has, what is it, 4 or 5 dogs?
It has supposedly 5. The 5th is missing in action, but definitely 4 burials. Like complete, real, in pit, nice, curled up, like you can see here, burials.
Oh,
Yeah.
so what is the interpretation there? I mean, that is that showing, do you think, that they're being buried along with a person, or is this a case where the dog was special and being buried? Because I know dogs were also, in some cases, on the menu historically.
Yeah, these were definitely buried alone. These aren't co-burials with humans. And we didn't find any evidence of cut marks or skinning or anything like that. It looked to be dogs that were being treated like humans, buried when they died in a kind of, this one had, you can see in the picture, kind of a stone metate kind of situation. It's unclear if that's really associated with a burial or not, but it seems, you know, when you see photos of these dogs, and you have the same thing happening in Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky area a little bit later, you see these very, very specific looking burials. You can tell someone laid them in there in a very specific way. They're not just kind of thrown haphazardly. They've got these kind of prepared pits. And the Stillwell burial was buried in what Perino, the excavator, said was kind of house floor, midden area, and there's also a human burial there as well. So they look to be not kind of any kind of sacrifice or food item, that it's just the dogs died and people had some level of this kind of domestic relationship with them to where they buried them.
Yeah, and this really stands out. This is not how you find dogs in the rest of the Paleo-Indian record. So these are some of the earliest ones. One of the cool things that and these are kind of the tale of 2 sites, right? These are not very far away. They're neighboring counties. They're both along the Illinois River in Illinois. Coster was the subject of archaeological excavations for decades. There were, it was groundbreaking field methods in the 1960s. We have basically the last 10,000 years is really well represented at Coster. We've got multiple dogs there. Stillwell was a surprise. So as we were looking at Coster, we were kind of chatting with some of the other archaeologists in the Illinois State Museum, Terry Martin, Bonnie Stiles, Mike Wyant, and others. And they said, well, there's also this other dog that we don't really know how old it is, but it has some associated artifacts that makes us think that maybe it's a little bit older. So one of the first things we did was send off samples for radiocarbon dating, and we were kind of surprised. Both date to just about 10,000 BP. They overlap significantly, and part of the reason why we were surprised is they're actually fairly different morphologically. The Coster dogs, they could be a family group almost. They're very very similar in size and shape. But the Stillwell dog has this much bigger mandible and some other things. So it was that kind of changed the game, and it made us think, oh, we should really think about this in a little bit more detail and try and sort this out. And so some of the first things that we're asking was, what do they look like? What do these early dogs look like? This is one of the few records in North America where we can get at this. And establishing size, they're about knee high. They're kind of this bulky terrier sort of dog. We can look at their mandibles and do some fancy statistics on them. In this, we're looking at kind of bite mechanics. In this axis, we're dealing with deep jaws and versus shallow jaws. In this axis, we're dealing with kind of long faces versus short faces. And you can see the Coster and the Stillwell dogs plot differently than coyotes, wolves, and coy dogs. So coy dogs don't actually plot in between wolves and dogs, or coyotes and dogs. They plot between wolves and coyotes, which is kind of interesting. We also did a little bit of, what did they eat? We're trying to get their lifestyles, trying to get at, what kind of role might they have played in some of these human societies. And so we did stable isotopes on some of these bones. On this chart, you can kind of see all the dog plots. On this axis, it's basically nitrogen isotopes and carbon isotopes on this axis down here. nitrogen is tracking basically the trophic level in the ecosystem that you're eating, and carbon is tracking kind of what plants are part of that ecosystem. And so whether they're C3 or C4, which is kind of grasses versus forest trees and herbs and things like that. And one of the cool things about this, and I blame reviewer two for this, because they told me, why aren't they eating fish? You should really compare them to fish. And it wasn't until we compared them to fish. We compared them to deer, and they weren't eating deer. We compared them to other modern Midwestern wolves too, which, we know they're not eating wolves, but we can at least look and see if they plot with wolves, which was not the case. And it wasn't until we really added in the fish that we were seeing that they were probably eating fish.
One of the times reviewer two was right.
Yeah, I know. This is the plus of the scientific review process.
Yeah.
It definitely improved this. But the cool thing about this chart is that not only does it have our early dogs here in this circle, but it also plots a whole bunch of later dogs. You can see they're all kind of up here, probably in that fish range. But as people adopt agriculture, adopt corn, adopt other domesticated plants, this carbon isotope value changes significantly. And so dogs are, we can't go into it basically assuming up front that they're eating what people are eating, but they're definitely following in a general way kind of the subsistence pattern of the villages that they are in, probably eating, scrounging for scraps on midden heaps and off the table. But so it gets that actually that leads into the next one. So one of the things that when we started realizing that dogs were eating the stuff that people were eating, and we were able to demonstrate this, there's actually a third silent partner in this trio, Dennis Lawler, who's a paleopathologist also at the Illinois State Museum. And he and Angela and I would talk about, well, what kind of diseases would dogs have? Would they have been shared with people? Would we have germs and bugs and diseases that might be kind of making the rounds in this disease ecosystem that is a village or that is a camp? And so Dennis has really looked at a lot of paleopathology on some of these early dogs. Paleopathology is looking at sickness and disease as it's expressed on bones. And we've looked at vertebrae, we've looked at different long bones and hip joints and things like that. We know that these dogs sometimes got sick, sometimes really sick, and they only survived because there was some sort of care administered. There's a lot of wear and tear, a lot of osteoarthritis in limbs that is kind of more osteoarthritis than you would see in wild populations.
Lots of gum disease, lots of broken teeth, lots of gum disease, lots of all kinds of mouth gum issues as well.
Yeah, lots of gum issues, but not a lot of major trauma. There's a little bit, but not a whole lot. But then the other part of this relationship is that burial idea. And I don't know, Angela, you want to talk a little bit about that and why Coster and Stillwell are interesting in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit before, but I mean, so now we know Coster and Stillwell are kind of the earliest examples of dogs we have so far in the Americas, and it's interesting to think about that the earliest dogs we have in the Americas are also in some very specific burials, some things that are very clearly intentional in the way they've been treated, and we kind of see this as the beginning of this this process of burial with dogs that we see again all through, especially in the mid-continent, but we see it in the Southwest, we see it all over the place where we start to have dogs being buried in very specific ways, and we see this in kind of cultural groups around the world, dogs being treated this way. And one of the questions I think that I've been asking, Chris definitely has been talking about, and Dennis and Terry and all the people that we even work with and talk about dogs is, what, especially these kind of early dogs, is what was the use of these dogs? If people were peopling the Americas and had dogs alongside them, were they being used as travois dogs? Were they pulling things? Were they transport? Were they hunting aids? And is this kind of burial the kind of showing the importance of this relationship, that a dog is not just a dog, but it's also potentially kind of personification, another person within the group, and a very important kind of member of a hunting party or a migrating party. So to see, especially at Coster, these very specific burials kind of in the earliest dog record, it may also be why we're finding dogs at places like this. I mean, one of our questions has always been, where are the dogs? Where are the Paleo-Indian dogs? You know, are they there? We just don't find them. Do we find them at Coster and Stillwell only because they were very intentionally buried? Is the record of Paleo-Indian archaeology so ephemeral that we just don't see the dogs, and they're everywhere. So this is one of the things you do get when you get buried dogs, is you're finding them very clearly. So yeah, the burials, I think, is kind of part of this thing that happens worldwide, showing that, you know, same is what we do with our dogs, right? And we do it not because our dog does anything particularly useful for us, but just that we care about it, and it's an important part of our life, and so we treat it with respect when it dies, and that might not be a far-fetched idea for Paleo-Indian hunter-gatherers as well.
All right, let's thank you, Angela and Chris. Let's bring in some questions from Facebook with David.
Sure thing. We've got lots of questions in our Facebook comments already. And just as a reminder, now's the time. If you have more questions, put them in the Facebook comments. Or if you can't leave a Facebook comment, go ahead over to Gray Fossil Site Twitter or Instagram, and we will find them there. I'm going to start with a question.
Great.
That is a very lighthearted question. This is from Donna. Angela and Chris, what dogs do you have?
Chris?
I don't have dogs. I have kids. Yeah.
Letting us down.
I know. We have 2 gerbils.
Gerbils. I always grew up with mutts. I always had mutts, but now I have West Highland Terriers because I like a small and feisty dog. I like a dog with a bit of attitude, so I'm a terrier person. But I told Chris the other day, I mean, the next step is to get a Chris, name of the dog?
Yeah, the Carolina.
A Carolina dog.
Yeah. That is the next step, I think. Now,
yeah.
I grew up with a bunch of beagle mutts, and
yeah, there you go.
Farm dogs. And so my first dog memories are farm dogs, usually when they got ran over by a car. But yeah, so kind of my first memories are these kind of not particularly domesticated animals, which is kind of an appealing memory. You know, we haven't been in a place where we can do dogs for a while, but I do remember these dogs that were half wild to begin with.
Excellent. We've got another question from one of our students, Christiane, and I think you may have touched on this in the presentation. Who asks, do we know of any domesticated breeds of dog that have gone extinct?
Well, this is a good question. So there's many layers to that. So you may have seen a recent thing just in the last few days about New Guinea singing dogs. We were talking about this. So New Guinea singing dogs are actually domesticated dogs that were brought to the region thousands and thousands of years ago and were thought to have gone extinct, and were just recently found again living wild for thousands and thousands of years. So the argument of whether they are still considered a domesticated dog or a wild species is an interesting debate, but we would definitely have breeds, things that would potentially have been bred in the Victorian period, especially in just post-Victorian period, that may have gone extinct. We had some points in some of the breeds where they got down to very few individuals, and that breed was kind of recreated by mixing together dogs of other types. So some of these breeds, if you go back and you look at early pictures from 1920s, 1930s of some things like a pit bull, for example, what it looked like in the 1920s versus what a pit bull looks like right now, it's a very different animal. So the idea of breeds is kind of tricky. But we do have some of these things like the Carolina dog, which is a domesticated dog, but potentially left alone in the swamps of the Carolinas for an unknown period of time, and kind of rediscovered. So yeah, that's probably the best answer to that.
I have one, David, from the Facebook, from Ethan Fullwood, about red wolves. How do they fit in genetically, morphologically?
Chris, do you want to say something about red wolves?
No.
Are they real?
Yeah, red wolves are real. They're obviously kind of endangered population, and there are a number of attempts to bring them back. The issue with red wolves is, again, the argument of what makes a species, kind of similar to the arguments going on with dingoes in Australia, is red wolves have been shown now that they are a cross between between a gray wolf subspecies and coyotes, but that introgression, that creation of the red wolf is ancient. So if a species that is essentially a hybrid, a cross, but was created in an ancient period without the effects of humans, is that a species that we should protect, or is that, and so that's an argument for conservationists and biologists, but with the input of zooarchaeologists and paleontologists and people who can comment on the DNA and say, okay, here's the case. I mean, red wolves is a great example of the DNA showing us what's actually going on, and then from there, the argument of what you do with a red wolf. Do you protect it or not? It's up to conservationists to decide that then.
Yeah, and that's a question that we really weren't even able to grapple with before we had DNA to really kind of start parsing it out.
Yeah.
Morphologically, it's really difficult to point at a bone and say that's a red wolf, that's a gray wolf, that's a coyote.
Yeah.
In part because each one of those groups is so hypervariable.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And as we kind of talked about, hybrids are a whole world of their own, and a world that we've really only touched on in archaeology, and is probably because it's very scary for us of how we deal with hybrids, and how we identify them, and what that means culturally. As I said, with Coster, with something that has a coyote ancestry, how do people interact with it? Is it a dog? Is it a coyote? What is it? How do we identify it without DNA? And what do we do with that once we identify hybridization just happening, kind of across the board? And Danny Walker, Wyoming, has some good, material on talking about hybrids between plains dogs, big plains dogs, and wolves up in the northern plains, and identifying potentially lots of hybrids up there, and that it's a normal, common occurrence that dogs would hybridize with northern wolves. So, maybe a dog to an ancient plains Native American is a hybrid.
Very interesting. ... While you're on the subject of breeds and species and dog confusion, and you actually mentioned this briefly, Greg McDonald wants to know, where does the dingo fit in?
I'm resisting a dingo joke. Do you want to say anything, Chris?
I think most of my interest in dogs, unfortunately, has been limited to North America. So you're probably more up on the literature than I am.
Yeah, dingoes are interesting. Dingoes are another conservation question. Dingoes, the most recent kind of data show that dingoes probably came to Australia 4,000-5,000 years ago, potentially earlier, but that they likely, at least a subpopulation of dingoes, kind of rewilded themselves very early on, and are essentially what I think technically would be called a feral domesticated dog. But again, just like New Guinea singing dogs, the question becomes, when does a feral animal kind of rewild itself and become wild animal again. And so if you ask people who are in the world of kind of this primitive Aboriginal dog world, in the world when getting singing dogs, dingoes, things like that, they're very clear about the idea of a land race, that primitive dogs are not from a domestication of an original kind of wolf population, but are themselves this original form, exactly as you see them. We know that's not the case, sadly, with dingoes and New Guinea singing dogs. They are from the same population, ancestral population that the rest of dogs are. They just have this early split off. They've taken a detour very early on, and they're kind of in their own world over there, clearly doing their own thing. So dingoes then again become like red wolves. The conversation about, are they a dog, are they a wild animal, and what do you do with them, becomes something that we contribute to as paleontologists and zooarchaeologists, and then leave to the conservationists to argue.
So Aaron Woodruff has one about dogs in North America and whether or not we still have basically Native American dogs.
Yeah. The morphological story there is different probably than the genetic story. And I think the genetic story is a lot more informative.
Yeah, I would say the 2018 paper that we did, we looked at thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of modern dogs. The genetics done by Adam Boyko and by the Dog 10K Genome Project. We have access to lots of modern dogs. And of all the dogs that we looked at, we found 5 that had any hint of this kind of pre-contact first North American, Native American dog. And of those, 3 of them were this Carolina dog. Why I'm saying I really need to get myself a Carolina dog. And those were, you know, the ancestries of those went from kind of about 1% to about 33% in those couple. And then there was 1 mixed breed dog from Peru and 1 mixed breedish kind of Chihuahua dog. But we have yet to find some hidden population of these ancient pre-contact dogs or dogs with that ancestry. Not to say that it's not out there somewhere, maybe in, you know, Mesoamerica or South America somewhere, some population of this dog, but yet to be found. Yeah.
We got a question here from Maggie who asks, what do you think could have led to the increased clade branching once entering North America?
Chris, do you have thoughts on clade branching?
I don't, well, yeah, it confuses me. I mean, the DNA has really changed so much of how we think about that early period. Not just dogs, but also people. And dogs and people, what Angela's research has really done is tie those things together and tie together some of the events that are shared within those lineages. And so, yeah, there's this Beringian standstill thing that's kind of happening up between Alaska and Siberia and Beringia before people come in, and also before dogs come in. I don't know. Can you add any more kind of?
I mean, I would say that the branching in dogs is just as confusing as the branching in humans at that period. I mean, you have these ancient Beringian human population that doesn't really make it very far or very long. It's not outside of Alaska. It's just kind of there at Trail Creek and Upper Sun River, and just kind of then doesn't really go anywhere that we've found yet. It's not outside the realm of possibility that people make it into Eastern Beringia, into Alaska, and then just kind of split off and, you know, say like, we're going this way, we're going this way, we're going this way, okay. And everyone takes their dogs and hightails it, some along the coast, some down through the ice-free corridor, some up, some down, going all over the place. And eventually we date that split to around 15,000. And then you just have these different dog populations that track where the different human populations go. Yes, Blaine.
Yes, so I wanted to bring one in from Mauricio Anton. I remember this question too. I remember talk about this, and it's about black wolves and whether or not that black coloration is something that's brought back from dogs to wolf populations?
Yes.
That's a quick answer. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting though, because it reminds us that not only are the dogs continuing to interbreed with the wolves, but the wolves are taking that back to their populations and changing their own populations.
Yeah, anytime I see a black wolf in a picture online or something, I think, oh, it's such a good example of thinking about, yeah, it goes both ways. And that black coloration is definitely remnant of integration with dogs. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of give and take.
All right.
David, do we have one more?
We have a few questions from some of our students, so I know that they'll get the opportunity to discuss a little bit afterwards. We have one question here from Donna who asks, of your samples, how many of them are purposeful burials versus not?
Depends on which sample specifically. I mean, Chris, we have how many burials like from the mid-continent area?
Most of the early dogs in the mid-continent are not burials. There's one at Rogers Shelter in Missouri.
Yeah.
More stuff in Blaine's backyard. A lot of the early stuff is it's house floors, it's midden piles, and that sort of thing. So that's one of the things about Coster and Stillwell that really pops out as something different.
Yeah.
Rogers Shelter. Yeah, Rogers Shelter is also, I count that within that group. But I don't think we had very decent DNA preservation from Rogers Shelter, which is why we don't talk about it very much.
Yeah, we didn't get DNA from that. I would say the burials really come in around 5,000-6,000 years ago is when you really see this explosion of burials in Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, the kind of Tennessee Valley River Authority, that whole WPA era of excavation. I mean, you have some sites in Tennessee and Kentucky where you're getting up to 50, 60, 70 individual dog burials. So that kind of era of amazing dog burials is kind of in this mid to late archaic period. In the beginning, we don't, as Chris said in one of those slides, the kind of Paleo-Indian early archaic record of dogs is still incredibly sparse. And it's not really until you get people kind of settling down in more sedentary populations, locations, that we start to see these big explosions of dogs and dog burials. And so again, the question for us, I guess, has always been, does that mean we really don't have dogs, or that we have dogs and the populations are just so ephemeral that they're just not burying them? We don't see the dogs. Some work with ethnography, you see dogs that are really important in certain groups, but if it dies, it usually dies out in the field while it's hunting or something, and people don't bring it back and bury it in the village. They bury it out, or they do certain things that put it in trees or put it in the river, or do all these kind of things that we may just be missing dogs if you have populations that aren't sedentary. So the story of where Clovis dogs are, if there are Clovis dogs, and where potentially pre-Clovis dogs are, is still, really a mystery. Anything pre-10,000, we don't know if it's real or not, if they're here or not. The DNA suggests they're here, but where we have 5,000 years of missing dogs, where are they?
Plenty of sites. Quite a few sites with bones and things like that, so some okay preservation, but just no dogs.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know we're right about at the end of the program. We may have missed a couple of questions through Facebook, but we'll scroll through and find those afterwards. Before we wrap that up, though, I do want to very selfishly ask one of my own questions. The history of humans domesticating animals, we've had dozens of different animals, dozens of different plants domesticated as, thousands and thousands of years ago. But dogs really stand out as the first animals that we seem to have domesticated. Today, there are just all sorts of different breeds. They're now one of the most widespread animals on the planet thanks to that domestication. what do you think it is about dogs that makes them so apparently well suited to be domesticated animals?
Do you have a dog, David?
Me, I do not have a dog now. I have a cat who is less well suited to be domesticated.
Is your cat domesticated? Our cat's domesticated. That's for another show.
They
Chris,
just use us.
We're
They just
domesticated.
use us, exactly. If you have a dog, then you know your dog is highly dependent on you in a way that is purely just giving you love and just desperate for your attention in a way that a cat is never really. I would say, first of all, that this is one of my biggest questions. We have no business domesticating a dangerous carnivore. What were we doing? What were we thinking? This is why the idea of domestication, especially since we've never seen another domesticated plant or animal prior to a dog, for me, the idea that it was intentional, that people saw a wolf and said, yep, gonna domesticate that, is probably not what happened. That some environmental, cultural, some kind of factor put us into this situation where domestication occurred in a more likely scenario, whatever that is. I have my ideas of what that may have been, but why we did it in the first place, I don't know. But I think that there are a lot of things about humans and wolves, dogs and humans, that go together pretty well. We're both kind of, with wolves, we're both daylight hunters who hunt in packs to take down animals, things that are larger than ourselves. And it's kind of a natural, I mean, if you've ever gone hunting with a dog, their desperation to just please you and kill something for you and drag it back to you and just be praised is just pretty amazing. I've gone hunting with dog-assisted hunters kind of all over the world, and it's just the same over and over. The dogs are just desperate to please. So I don't know if Chris has any insight about why and how.
I don't. I'm hoping that, some of the things that we're throwing at this record will help narrow down the number of scenarios that are possible. But the other part of this, I think, that fascinates me is that this is a co-evolutionary process. You have two different species, two different taxa that are not even closely related, but they are strongly affecting the evolution of the other, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, to that point, when it comes back to the Americas and you think about dogs potentially assisting people or joining people in the peopling of the Americas, I mean, dogs are just a really amazing kind of Swiss Army knife of animals. They work as sentries, they clean up all the messy stuff after you, they serve in desperation as a food source, as a fur source, as a bed warmer, as just about anything. They can be all and do all of just about anything. So if you're thinking about something accompanying you on a long, very difficult journey, then a dog that can haul your stuff and then you can eat it and skin it for its fur at the end of the journey is a pretty, an amazing use of a complete animal. So yeah, it's a Swiss Army knife of animals. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, although evolutionarily we're quite different, socially we're very similar, and how we relate to one another and how we hunt. And I know some hypotheses are that some human hunting strategies may have even been adopted from watching wolves. And it's not very hard to imagine either people coming across or getting puppies in one way or another.
Yeah.
And it's very easy then to sort of socialize them into being human-like and us being dog-like.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we better wrap it up, David.
Absolutely. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and watched and participated and clicked those fun little reaction icons on the Facebook video. We really appreciate it. And thanks, of course, to our guests, especially Angela. Chris is here all the time. Chris is easy to get.
I appreciate you being here, Chris.
Yes. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.